Content Podcast, episode 182. Designer, producer, educator, and researcher, Garrett.
Whether or not we get to a complete and total collapse, or we're looking at collapses of very specific systems for it, like right now I'm concerned with modeling what we want on the other side as best as possible, so that, whether or not it's a person or, a machine learning algorithm as artificial intelligence, when it's looking back on the things that it's basing its future decisions on, that it's not just the dominant systems that got us into this mess.
Garrett is producer for Mixed Reality Performance Collective, Toaster Lab, and director of the Center for Sustainable Practice in the Arts, a think tank on sustainability in arts and culture, as well as associate professor of ecological design for performance at York University in Toronto. He maintains a design practice focused on the integration of ecology, technology, and sonography. Now, my first conversation with Ian was during episode 54, called Empowering Artists, and it took place by Zoom on May 25th, 2021, as did most of my other conversations there during the pandemic. At the time, we were both serving on the mission circle of the Sectoral Climate Arts Leadership for the Emergency Scale, but we had been exchanging about art and sustainability for many years, and I've always appreciated my conversations with Ian. This time we met in person on Monday, June 18th, 2024, in Ian's home in Toronto, where he lives with his wife Justine and their two dual citizens, Miles and Henrietta, as well as their dog Maggie, who you'll hear in the background once in a while during our conversation. Now, we talked about the many interconnections between his work as a designer, producer, educator, and researcher, among other things, in the field of sustainability in arts and culture, as well as talk about the challenges facing the arts and climate movement in Canada at this time. And it was especially interesting for me to revisit our 2021 conversation because of this statement by Ian that has stayed with me since that time. Sometimes it inspires me and sometimes it haunts me.
I don't want to confuse the end of an ecologically unsustainable, untenable way of civilization working in this moment with a complete guarantee of extinction. There is a future. It may look very different. And sometimes I think the inability to see exactly what that future is or plan for it can be confused for there not being one. And I'm sort of okay with that uncertainty. And in the meantime, all one can really do is the work to try and make that, whatever it ends up being, more positive. There's a sense of biophilia about it.
Yes, indeed, there is clearly more uncertainty now than ever. But as you'll hear, Ian does a lot of positive work for the benefit of the arts community. And I agree that we are best served to be both aware of our pain and grief while being fully engaged in action for a future we cannot yet see, but that is unfolding. The episode is called Modeling What We Want on the Other Side, and you'll understand in a minute what that means. Ian, welcome back to Conscient Podcast.
It's lovely to be back.
Last time we spoke about 3 years ago, it was episode 54, and it was called Empowering Artists, and that's one of the things you do. But a lot of things have happened since then. You're active in many ways in different organizations. So I'd like to have an update on what you're doing, what you're passionate about, what you're concerned about, those kinds of things. And I encourage people to listen to the sort of part one, because you talked a lot, and we talked for an hour about all kinds of things. So we're not going to repeat that. But I will ask you to introduce yourself for those who don't know you, your background, where you're from, that kind of thing. And then we'll jump into, the end of the world as we know it.
But we've got tea, and we feel fine. So, background. I typically wear a few different hats. All of which are somewhat related, and at some point I feel like I see them as converging upon another, so it just feels like one very elaborate hat for me most of the time. So I am the director of the Center for Sustainable Practice in the Arts and co-founder, and that's been running since 2008. That's one of the things that's changed a lot. I might come back to that and the changes that have happened with that organization since 2021. I also teach at York University. That's part of the reason that I am based in Toronto on Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Wendat, and Métis land, where the current treaty holders are the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I teach ecological design for performance there. I'm a tenured professor teaching design, and then sort of resources. It's within the theater and dance department, but now a lot of it crosses over into other areas of arts production and management, and some of it's very practical and resource oriented and about eco-efficiency, and some of it is more within the eco-scenography realm, where we're conceptually thinking about our critical engagement with space and performance and how we perform the world and space as a studio practice. And then that crosses over into with my partner Justine and a friend of ours, Andrew Sempri, who's based now at this point in the States. We have a collective called Toaster Lab, which does a lot of primarily digital work, working with a lot of extended reality tools. And it's not sort of tool specific. We sort of find the tools for the types of projects that we're working on, but a lot of the work that is being generated from that connects back to the things that we're passionate or care about around the world and the future, around community and community narratives and who gets to access or tell their stories, and also around how that intersects with environmental issues and a spatial practice. So sort of see it as a bit of scenography. So those have been ongoing. I'm also, I have two children. My son Miles is going to be 10 in a couple of days, and my daughter Henrietta is 7.5. And we've got a small dog named Maggie. So we have a very pleasant life. Yeah, I think she had come to greet you, and now she's found another thing to do, as dogs are wont to do. For it, there was no offering of food or play, and so she's gonna go find something else or take a nap. So yeah, I'm originally from California, and I moved up to Toronto because of the position at York about almost 12 years ago. And while I was there, I was working for the Center for Sustainable Practice in the Arts, and working as a freelance, primarily designer for live performance, but also working on supporting installations and different types of art practices, and teaching part-time primarily at California Institute of the Arts, which is where I had gone to grad school as well. And continue to maintain connections with a number of collaborators and think about issues related to California, because that's where a lot of my own sort of like ecological consciousness developed.
I was going to ask you about that. Where did your ecological consciousness develop?
Yeah, well, I was born in Los Angeles and grew up in Los Angeles. And, throughout my childhood and early adulthood, we were under drought conditions. So I grew up aware of those issues. Also, just the city sort of is defined around its relationship with water or lack thereof in a local vicinity, and in the way that that resource gets moved around. And so it's always sort of a consciousness there around that, around things like, I was used to there being a fire season. So as we're thinking about wildfires and how those have been growing, that's something that's always sort of been a presence in my life, just because it's something that it's like, we'd have ash falling from nearby forest fires because of the dryness there. How that connects to infrastructure and moving people around. Is a very car-based city, sort of known for its air quality, or its poor air quality, which has been improving. But then, so because of those things, I spent a lot of time growing up getting involved in environmental issues, or issues that connected to the environment in some way. Or form, part of it related to like justice issues. So like getting involved with transit activism with it, because it's very car focused, and advocating for the expansion of rail, but not at the expense of bus service for it, because it's a very decentralized city. It's very hard to service in that regard, though it has a very large infrastructure. I was involved with, I would volunteer for like the Surfrider Foundation, which worked on like keeping waterways, ocean, coasts clean, primarily made up of surfers. I don't surf, but we hung out together. And then the Tree People, which worked on forestry issues. So the Christmas tree that we had, not when I was growing up, but once Justine, my partner, and I got together, I believe that she has her parents have always had a living tree, and I believe it was grown from a seedling that was provided by the Tree People, which would do these school presentations where everybody would take away a sapling.
Well, I'm sure we could go on with the background, but I think people get an idea of where you're coming from, and maybe why you're doing what you're doing, right? Mm-hmm. So before we get into the detail of what the center is doing and other things, where are we at in Canada on art and climate? Because I've noticed a kind of dip, but what are your feelings about it? Because you're kind of at the heart of it, right? In many ways, with the projects you lead and the people you're teaching. What's going on?
Yeah, it's interesting that you said that, because I just read a grant narrative for a project that I'm only tangentially, and somebody shared with me, and there is that question on every Canada Council application that is the last one in the narrative one. That's like, is there anything else that we should know? And then it talked about being in dialogue with other climate engaged projects, and it pretty much listed 4, maybe 5 projects that somehow tie back to the CSPA, or be directly or through the research funded at York. So that was interesting to see for that. So yeah, we're in an interesting position, but it's very familiar in some ways, for me at least. When there is austerity, things tend to contract. And, we started the CSPA in 2008. The work was predating to that. The genesis of the CSPA was around creating an umbrella for a few different projects that were happening. And it was shortly before the economic downturn of that year. And so there was a lot of excitement. People were willing to invest in and fund projects related to climate within the arts, and then it contracted quite a bit, and that's happened a few times. We've seen that cycle a few times, and it feels familiar in that regard. I think we're farther along, and there's more people involved. Part of that's just time. There's fewer barriers, I think, perceptual barriers at the top end, like people who are resistant to it, or for whom they're like, that's nice. Rarely do we see anybody who is entirely resistant. We see more apathy than we see conflict with wanting to work in these things. But with the cost of everything and everything happening in the world at any given time, when there's not as much generosity financially, we start to see these projects sort of winnow a little bit for it. I often say that the most sustainable thing about the Center for Sustainable Practice in the Arts is just that we haven't gone away. So we're sort of like used to adapting to those realities that nobody has yet to really, really embed it within the field. Whether or not that's an organization or a funder or the council specifically, etc. There's a lot of interest there, but at the same time, that's always competing with that core mission component of we're supporting artists directly.
Well, I've been observing a lull in activity, but not a disinterest in the climate emergency, because how can you be disinterested in your future, right? But what you say, there's competing priorities, there's the recovery from COVID, and yet I'm shocked to hear that, because you and I and many others know the severity of the challenges that we face, and it's not just the climate emergency, it's the poly crisis, Why are we not more in an action mode? It's fair to say that artists have always been in action mode. They were creating works about things they care about, including the environment and social justice and all that. But when Scale was created, 3 years ago at the beginning of the pandemic, the idea was to create a movement. And it is happening to a certain extent. But I'm not feeling it yet. Feeling it
That's fair.
And I'd love to see it, not just that issue. I mean, that's an issue I think we all care about. But how can the arts sector play a larger role without necessarily bending itself out of shape and contribute more?
Well, I think that there are players out there in which we do see that, and that people have maintained some of that. I think that there's less cohesiveness. I also think that, and we see this regularly, is that people are just tired. Like, there's so far, very few people are able to make their living from focusing on issues of climate related to their artistic practice. Part of that is systematically, it's just, there's barriers to being able to do that because like nobody's mandate necessarily at this point really includes that, unless you're specifically doing environmental work. And so that then comes down to what are the choices that we're making around it. And it always connects to then individuals involved in those organizations and their priorities there. And so I think that part of what we're seeing is that reshuffling. We've seen a lot of people who are taking on really strong leadership, moving around. Part of that is fatigue from things unrelated to climate. Some of it is related to climate, and just like, how much can I put into this work and sacrifice other things to do that. I'd like to also be able to do other things, but a lot of it is also just, it's been really hard over these last few years. And I think that a lot of the promise, we're sort of in a backswing from like the promise of a lot of the change that was discussed in the pandemic, with many things going on pause, that we didn't come back into a completely re-envisioned artistic field, or artistic fields, however much they overlap or not. And I think that there's still things that are happening or in process. I think we did a better job of identifying things that we need to address during that time. And one of the things that like I think is always important to keep in mind, one is that, we're thinking about it on a human time scale, and it's taken us a while to get to this point, like from however you want to frame the start of the Anthropocene, right? It's taken us hundreds of years to get here. If you look at like just the entire colonial project as part of that, and it's really overwhelming to undo those things. And I also think that there's no reason to believe that it's not going to take as long for us to repair things as it took for us to get to this point. I mean, I think that's part of when, we talk about thinking about 7 generations ahead. That's also about releasing the hope that you're going to see immediate change too, that you're like setting up things for the future. It's not just about, I'm making changes that will last for 7 generations, but I'm also setting up things that will last that long. And whether or not it's using that frame or any other that sort of period of time. So I think part of it is stamina. it's hard to maintain that stamina. I think that, there's things shuffling around. We see this now whenever we're talking about like political shuffling. There was a lot of excitement around Guilbeault and the Ministry of for Heritage. And then there's been multiple cabinet shuffles since then, and those priorities have changed around, again, tied to folks. So I think we're seeing a lot of people are trying to maintain as much work as possible, and there's excitement there. But I think that a lot of the systems that we're working against are really hard to focus on that. And so it's less noisy, it's less bright and visible. I think it's less shiny and less new. And it is work that we're working on figuring out how to sustain. I think we're at a better baseline than we were before. And that is more success to me than if we still had the same level of excitement. Because essentially we need everybody involved with it. So if we can start from a wider base, the next sort of leap, I think, will be that much farther.
Well, an example in an episode that we'll have broadcast by now, because I do them sequentially, one of your staff or one of your colleagues, Sarah Fioravanti, was on a panel in Montreal for Choral Canada, and we were talking about climate change and choral music. And it was really interesting because there was a lot of work being done on repertoire, but not very much on the green tools, on the carbon, because some people said, well, we're so insignificant. And then Sarah and others explained it's a process. It's not just a number. It's the process of engagement. And I think a lot of, especially young people, are increasingly interested in knowing, having that baseline and making a difference, and then commissioning repertoire and working cross-sectorally. So that you're right, that is happening. I noticed it in the choral community, as for example. But what I'm not seeing is a sense of what Scale was meant to do at the very beginning, which is to create a coalition of everybody, and let's really. But it was a bit of a dream as well, because it was the beginning of COVID, and we were sitting in our rooms, and every Friday we'd get together and say, we should change the world, but we're all stuck at home, And then when we got out of our homes, we had to live our lives.
Right.
But I just hope that there's a sense of, that's not so much renewal, but an intensification and amplification around the challenges that we face. Because artists have always done that. And what do they need? Of course, they'll need more resources. I'm starting to think about, emergency preparedness, and what kind of tools do artists need for that, and how can they contribute, and what do they need? Anyway, Ian, maybe we can start getting more granular now.
That one in particular is a really interesting one to come to, because if you want to ask about projects that we're working on, is that emergency and disaster preparedness has become very much part of front and center in our mind. It's actually work that we're coming back to. Devin Hardy, who is the program director for the CG tools, so has been focused on footprinting. Before coming into the CG tools, and then as they were developed and have since been wrapped into the CSPA. But as she was working independently, when we originally met each other, she was working with festivals, particularly fringe festivals, on doing scenario planning. So thinking about long range thinking about climate impacts and how those festivals are changed, or how they prepare for weather events, heat events, etc., which we see are happening more and more. It may have been now nearly a year ago, there was the resilience sort of conference that was primarily between those who are presenting or producing work outdoors. This last year, I was at the USITT conference. That's a U.S. Institute for Theater Technology, and we have a long relationship with them because we partner with the Broadway Green Alliance, and so we've done a lot of the programming on these topics in partnership over the last decade for the length of our existence. And there was a real shift in the conversation this last year where we started talking about these impacts, as we were seeing more and more performances challenge. Like, we have really interesting information on it. One of the examples that we were using there was that in 2017, due to air quality, there were 2 performances at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival that season that were had to be canceled because it wasn't fit to have people gathered. And then it may have not been this last summer, but recently all but 2 from like late July until into September had to be canceled, and then move from an outdoor stage to an indoor stage just to maintain any of the performances, which has all sorts of effects organizationally, etc. And it's a conversation that there's going to be an article coming out. It might be up by the time this is available. That is co-authored by Molly Braverman from the Broadway Green Alliance, and then Hannah D'Amico, who's at IATSE, where this is also starting to be taken up as a labor issue around how this is impacting the livelihood of theatrical stage employees, that TSE and IATSE. And so I think that there's a big shift towards that thinking. I think you can look at like the early work of like Jen Ray around, and the Center for Reworlding
in Australia.
Yeah, and the Refuge Project, which has been running since 2016. We're having a conversation right now because we're planning on putting forward proposals for developing frameworks for this sort of planning in conjunction with the Creative Green tools. And in reaching out to potential partners for it, it turns out that there is multiple projects out there that like none of them are necessarily like out there. There's no deliverables for them yet, but there's been a shift where I can identify, ours included, at least 3 large scale projects with large partnerships that are specifically looking at these adaptation issues and building on that. It's almost, this is in a less than 3 weeks time, the Sustainable Innovation Fund is going to have its last Cultivate deadline. And because of the nature of our organization, I'm kind of dreading it because there's like 5 projects that would be appropriate for that. I'm hoping that it gets replaced with something, but there are these innovative projects that are out there that are starting to focus and redirect our attention to these more acute and direct impacts, where we're not just talking about emissions, we're not just talking about overall environmental impact, but we're running up against, we're actually, more and more people are directly feeling the impacts. We're tipping the point.
Well, I guess feeling it will make you act, but knowing it can also make you act and try to prevent it. And it's a mix of the two, right? We're mitigating, we're adapting, and we're, whatever comes after that, responding, I guess. I've been hanging out with the Deep Adaptation Forum people, and they use those terms, collapse awareness, collapse acceptance, collapse response. But, in the history of art, there have always been moments, difficult moments in society where art has played a role to, I don't want to call it mitigate, but to use its power to either console people or lift their spirits or whatever. So as we get into the projects, I was reading the magazine this morning, the CSPA's journal, I think it's called, right?
Mm-hmm. The quarterly.
Quarterly, yeah. It's nice, and I think people should know more about it because it's a nice collection of writing, and there isn't that much writing about these issues. There's always a thematic, and this one's about death, and so I was really interested in that. So maybe tell me more about what the CSPA does with the journal, and I talked to Kim Richards a few weeks ago in Vancouver, and she told me all about the Department of Utopian Arts and Letters. It used to be called Utopian Studies.
Yeah, it turned out that there's an entire field of study in an existing journal called Utopian Studies, and so we realized we had to change the name.
But
so.
you don't need to talk about that one so much because Kim kind of covered it. But what's CSPA doing with the journal and its other projects that is people should know about? Yeah,
so Kim did cover a lot of what's happening with Dual, but part of that is looking at working with artists to think about how do we get to the other side of crisis, and sort of their approaches. Some of them are more ambitious or more abstract and more future oriented than others, but looking at what the curriculum for utopian approaches to how do we exist in the future are there. So we've got 4 or 5 of them out right now. I'm actually might be miscounting. There's one that I think is out, but is not. But we're going to they're all going to be out, and by all I mean 12, possibly a 13th. We've got a backup. Will be out by the end of June. And that's sort of setting the tone. We're now looking at what the future of that is, and also working with those artists to further develop those ideas. So part of that is starting very much, and it comes out of our project or a conversation at scale around education, what we actually mean by that, and thinking through. I think part of what we're seeing also is in the transition is as an adjustment in the pipeline of people, which is an interesting way to think about this and metaphor, but thinking about who's coming through education, who is coming through various types of training, or just coming through the field. What are the different ways in which they are being prepared to think about these things? So part of this is that blue sky thinking. In addition to that, we're also in the process of re-envisioning what had been. We ran a couple of creative climate leadership retreats, one in person, one online. There were things that weren't necessarily serving the Canadian arts field that we wanted to address with that. So we actually decided to go back and re-envision how that worked with a number of partners. So it took about a year working with people who had previously participated. We had sort of an Indigenous Advisory Council that was working with it as well. And in a couple of weeks' time, we will be gathering sort of the first group of that. It's more sort of a beta test of people who have been involved previously and consulted on it to sort of try out some elements of it, so that hopefully we'll be moving to what we're referring to as a CSPA convergence that is looking less at like a leadership model and trying to train people for leadership, and more relational networking and collective leadership through those relationships. Because I think it's one of the things that really challenges what we're doing is a networking aspect to it. When we were all online, and I think that this relates to what we were talking about in terms of scale, like it was pretty easy for us to say, let's get a group of people from disparate locations together, because everything was online already. And our return to some of the in-person work, like some of that still happens and convenes, but a lot of our work has moved back to being focused to like a region for that. So I think that we're looking at how do we build those infrastructures and build those relationships so that people are working through in a similar way. And that's our hope for this new form of converging, which we're at this point titling Convergence. We do have the publication streams that we're doing. The quarterly is something that is probably our longest standing program, but that's also grown quite a bit insofar as we're also looking at different avenues of distribution. Like it gets used a lot. I think its primary use has been academically, even though it is not developed as an academic journal. Like it's not a peer-reviewed academic journal. It's not quite a magazine. It doesn't have advertising in it. It's more of sort of, I've always sort of positioned it as like a small catalog of a exhibition that is never realized. That it's always curated around a topic, featuring various artists to stimulate a conversation, and we've managed to keep it running. That we're now into the 40s of the editions. We've been running it for more than 10 years. Sometimes quarterly has been an aspirational title for it, but we're pretty well settled on that now. And that has also gone along with working on what we refer to just as CSPA reports, which are sometimes they're just little reports of people that we've been working with, where we can package that together so that we can get the information about what we learn about working with an organization out into the world in a public and shareable way. We've also are trying to start up a series of working with artists who are working right now in sustainable ways, like they're bringing it into the way that they're making work, but it's also part of what they're working with. The first one that we've done is with UK artist Afra Shemza, who is using waste plastic, primarily oceanic waste plastic, and has been working with open source machines to reform that in a less toxic environment that you can that they're open source plans that you can put together on your own to sort of like create cheat codes out of it. And so she's been using that as the sort of material in a number of her installations, and been doing public art installations about the ocean, sea level rise, and plastics. And so we created a book that both went through how she creates it, like step by step, quite literal instructions for how you could create these things as well, and then also the critical engagement with the work itself. So we're trying to find as many ways as possible to give people the foundational tools to be able to engage with different topics, whether or not that is going to be based off of how do I change my emissions, relationship with materials, or relationships with my region or the land that I'm in. How do I sort of imagine other futures that aren't just me continuing to recreate the situation in which I'm already working in.
And so what's new is maybe just the connections between these different projects.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they're cross-pollinating. Maybe I know you facilitate international conversations
Mm-hmm.
around tool development, that kind of thing. And I wish there were 1,000 Ian Garretts in the world.
There was too. I've had a lot of other things I need to do too.
Well, you
take kids to swimming lessons and things like that.
But I just appreciate the effort you put into organizing and the generosity around collaboration. And so when I see the projects like the green tools, which I've talked to people in the field and they say, why would I do that? But once they start doing something similar, they realize that they feel much better about themselves because they have a baseline and
Mm-hmm.
that kind of thing.
And just know.
And it works. That works. And then they say, well, we need more climate art. And I said, well, I don't know that we need necessarily. I mean, is that what you want to do? If you do, go for it. Do it well and make sure it has impact. But what we need is engagement with the
Mm-hmm.
issues, and in whichever way the artist wants to engage, use their skills and abilities to move us in a direction that's sustainable. That's why I like the name,
Mm-hmm.
Center for Sustainability. So what's missing, Ian? Don't say money.
I mean, I'm not going to say that that's not missing.
Oh.
It is there. Money makes it feasible to do it because you need people to have the attention span. You don't just need to split me into 1,000. You need to split a lot of people up because we're working with very few people. There's lots of artists out there, and all of them are, maybe not all of them, I don't know every one of them, but many of them are working much more than they would be if they were not an artist, if they had got into something more commercially viable and they had been a banker or something like that. I mean, people still work long hours, but people do a lot with very little within the arts. It's interesting also being in a university and seeing like the amount of grants that go into like a science application, and it's great, and they're very efficient with their funds, but then hearing someone refer to $70,000 as a small grant, I'm like, do you know how much that an artist can do with that amount of money? I mean, just the availability of space and time, I think, is part of it. I think, it's not the money, it is the space and time. It is the availability to not do other things. Like, how many people with cost of living or other things that they need to do are like the difference between funding and not is whether what they're choosing to do, is that the freedom to be able to choose to focus on the things that are more values based and that are viable or going to lead to more opportunities. So I think that there's time space as part of it, whether or not that comes through funding or otherwise, but being able to open that up relates a lot to the conversations around things like UBI, just like freeing people up from the obligations of being able to live in a world that is increasingly more expensive, and where like class division particularly, is growing more and more, especially with the amount of tragedy which is happening in the world on a regular basis in seemingly an increasing way, that is making it, harder and harder to feel positive at times for things. I think it's also the tools. So what we're trying to provide ultimately are tools that try and make that easier for it. I think one of the things that I've noticed over the 16 years of CSPA and however many more years of just working in this realm is that every time we come to another round of excited activity, these connections don't exist. First of all, like we are disciplinarily divided, regionally divided. When it comes to our values that connect us, I think we're just coming to a point where there are infrastructures that allow us to connect on those matters. That's the purpose of, it's not necessarily a CSPA project, but more generally, the Sustainability in the Art, or SATA project. That's a SSHRC-funded project that I'm working on with Tara Wright at Dalhousie.
Yeah, I'm on the advisor.
You are. And so like the purpose of that and the challenge of that is making those connections so that people aren't constantly reinventing things. I think what the tools are and what the purpose of the guides are and the reason to support those things and these foundational elements like the CG tools, like imagined curriculum through Dual, like free training, like documentation that can easily be shared around, that we keep under Creative Commons license and are just trying to get out there into the world. The reason for that is so that it's easier to find and it's easier for people to connect to things, because so much effort gets put into starting. And that excitement, that's what we were talking about at the beginning, is like, I think what we're dealing with is an issue of stamina, is that there's so much effort put into startup that people need rest. And so a lot of this work is around how do we make it easier to do the work that you want to do? How do we make it easier to get to that advanced point where it's like, I can figure out what my priorities are in terms of whether or not it's material or working in different sorts of ways. I need a community agreement. One of the areas that I'm like passionate about right now, particularly within Green Theater, is around intellectual property. I'm on the board of the Associated Designers of Canada, and our most recent collective bargaining with PACT, there are really great intellectual property protections within that agreement and within our other agreements as well, which is great for the designers because that's their livelihood, is their ideas, right? But when you look at it, it looks at protecting like the total design, and there's not a lot said about elements of it. So what it means is that you have to go and negotiate all of those individual elements of it. And that's a lot of work. And no one has capacity to take up this as a legal matter. So there's no precedent of what's going to happen. So everybody just sort of like says like, well, we can't do reuse because that's part of a design. So I'm really interested in that because it's like, what is the document? What is the resource that we can provide, the tool, the writer to those contracts, which will allow somebody to articulate those things so that those protections don't stand in the way of reuse. Or when we're trying to build relationships with indigenous partners, however that's organized, like individuals, tribal, etc., in, our default, this gets back to intellectual property as well, our default intellectual property understanding in Canada, like Big C Canada, under the Copyright Act, is you create something and you are the owner of that thing. Well, in different types of knowledge transfer, that is like counter to the belief that just because you have something or you document something that belongs to you. So we've seen more and been using in our creative work like agreements that devolve rights back to the community that we're working with, which is always interesting that it takes like 6 pages of legal speak to create like an actual legal protection for intellectual property that otherwise, if we did nothing, to undo that takes a lot of work. And so I think that those sort of things are what people need those tools, because those people aren't lawyers. Like, they're not experts in intellectual property. They don't have a lot of time. So how do we put those things into place that become those lever points in which we can change the conversation?
But it assumes to a certain extent some level of social stability, which this morning on the train from Ottawa, I was reading the Policy Horizons Disruptions report, which is anticipating what is likely to happen in terms of, let's call it changes in democracy, but things that fall apart for very specific reasons, lack of resource, therefore something happens, or migration, become climate migration. And as society changes, there are going to be different circumstances. So what you just explained legally might not be applicable in 10 or 15 years. We don't know. It's good to do it because then you have a foundation for which you've agreed. But then when the world becomes much more difficult, just physically, in terms of, then how do we cooperate? How do we communicate? How do we avoid conflict? How do we work through in much more difficult conditions? Like many places in the world, here in Canada, we have difficult conditions in certain regions, but not like others. And so that's what I'm thinking about, Ian, is how has that happened in the past? So that's more of a research project, but then how in the future will the arts survive, continue to be relevant, and contribute to society in, let's call it mutation, but I think it'll be collapse, personally.
Well, I think the arts are going to survive regardless of, like, there to be two humans, and it's whether or not we're talking about an arts field that's professionalized and has grant funders and things like that. And I just now have this picture of like a post-apocalyptic world where someone's trying to get together a panel to review some grant proposals to distribute resources. Yes, like the creative process, like it's also just interesting to think of. I mean, jumping around a little bit with, well, actually, I'm going to back up 1 second. So one of the utilities of these things is, yes, it's good for stability. It's also ways of, when we were working through towards braiding, right? And thinking about organizational
structures. Which is a document by Vanessa Andreotti and Elwood Jinney.
Yeah. When we were working through that at scale and looking at this juxtaposition, like this cultural divide between, and then how do you bring these things together? I think that, the legal framework, the Copyright Act might not survive, but the principles for understanding and bringing understanding between those who would have been coming from one system of ownership around knowledge and artistic production and another, and setting those up so that we accept that there's nuance there and that we may have previously had systems for it. I think when various types of collapses happen, one, at least in a localized sense, most things point to like community support and collective action as social folks. So in some ways, maybe there's a silver lining there. But I think that also clinging on to things, and when I say that, it sounds negative, but I think like holding on to things that, especially in that transition point for those who will have experienced both worlds, that holding on to those things is going to be important. Like, there are going to be things of like referring back to, like, we're always modeling off of things that have happened before. It's interesting that I've got notes here, and I've got this other thing that's entirely unrelated, which is an essay that I'm working on that talks about the relational aspects of performance, AI, and agriculture, which we can go into more if you'd like to. But it talks about relationality, and a lot of it, and my interest in things like AI is because it's backwards facing. It's always responsive to existing information for it. So think about it as sort of what Walter Benjamin had described with this the Paul Klee figure of the Angela Novus, the angel of history, looking back on history and seeing it as like one catastrophe as opposed to a series of events that got us to there. And so, like, our view of the past is going to be informed by things that happened before, whether or not it's documented or in our memory for things. So I think whether or not we get to a complete and total collapse, or we're looking at collapses of very specific systems for it, like, right now I'm concerned with modeling what we want on the other side as best as possible, so that, whether or not it's a person or, a machine learning algorithm as artificial intelligence, when it's looking back on the things that it's basing its future decisions on, that it's not just the dominant systems that got us into this mess. I think that's like coming back to this idea of forward thinking generations ahead for things that you're not going to realize, that, like, sometimes you plant seeds and some grow and some don't. And so I'm trying to do as much within the frame that we have right now to set up things so that when something is trying to be rebuilt, that there is better fodder than late stage capitalism.
I think a number of people, just this week I talked to artists who are thinking the same thing. I use the term creating an artist survival toolkit, but it's, that idea, and it doesn't have to be a negative, right? Because there always are cycles in civilizations. There's the rise and fall of, and we're falling now because we're going to run out of energy and we've overconsumed resources on the planet, and we're going to suffer from that behavior. But that doesn't mean that humanity will stop. It means it's going to slow down at a certain point, and it will have an opportunity. And I like the timeline you said earlier. It'll take us long to undo what we've done. And once somebody first said that to me, I said, "But that's impossible. We can't wait 1,000 years." And then the person said, "Well, why not?"
And do we even get to decide? Like, the trees around us right now are working on a completely different timescale than we're imagining. So there's a sense of urgency that we have, that we want to do something and we want to see things change, but those things take time. We used to run an award, a Fringe Sustainable Practice Award at the Edinburgh Fringe with our friends at at Creative Carbon Scotland. And one of the early awardees was Puppet State Theatre, which is an Edinburgh-based company, had a puppet adaptation of The Man Who Planted Trees, which is this idea of a man who spent his life reforesting a valley and the change in the landscape that created. But that had to happen over that course of time, where, we see different types of flora and fauna restore, waterways move from place to place. There's a human impulse to think of, like, the moment that we're in is the moment that we will be in. It's raining now, so it will always be raining. It is sunny now, so it will always be sunny. And if we can release ourselves from that thought, and that's also why I think that this is why art, right, is that if our algorithmic approach to speed and efficiency and making those better, of reflecting back on what we were doing and improving those systems, like, that is all historically facing. That is always backwards facing. There's not imagination in there. It's not going to invent something that didn't previously exist necessarily. It might combine them in novel ways, but it's not going to imagine something new. That's what we require artists to do.
I don't know that we need to go beyond that, because that's a good encapsulation of of this conversation and previous conversations. But is there anything else that we haven't covered that you'd like to add?
Yeah, it's interesting because we've talked about dual a bunch, but it's not necessarily my artistic practice. It's mainly supporting artists with it. These have been topics that also are sort of creeping into my own, like the type of work that I want to make. So there's a couple of projects that are happening right now. One of them is much more around systems and rethinking systems of performance, around hybrid performance. That's something that I'm excited about, which is this idea that we have, whether or not somebody experienced them through the pandemic, through the onlineness of that time, or is otherwise interested in telematic or mixed reality technologies, like we lost some of that in our return to like the physical, the carbon reality for it. I think that there's still things to be gleaned from that. And even before the pandemic forced more of that work, I was really interested in this idea of the way that our cultural infrastructure works and who gets to do work or not in different places. Like there's these international festivals that congregate lots of people together. I've had a long relationship with the Edinburgh festivals, and there's a lot of people making a lot of money doing that, and it's not the artists that are doing that. And every year that I'm there are people who have visa issues. I've been doing sustainability work, and I'm like, what is my responsibility for actually, how can I do that and do this travel, and trying to say like, what are my priorities here? Or just people who have, obligations outside of, they have work, they have family, etc. Like, we have to realize that a lot of our cultural, our international touring cultural infrastructure privileges those who are young, childish, and affluent, and so that tends to be the global north and white dudes. And so thinking about, are there ways of problematizing that through technology? So exploring different forms of hybrid performance. Last year, I produced a show that had the cast and crew split between a live performance in Edinburgh and a studio here in Toronto, with a social VR intermediary, so that people could also watch it online. But they were 3 concurrent, distinct experiences as opposed to just like filming something. And I'm excited to explore more of that. And some of that's bridging over into what I was talking about in terms of trying to cook up and devise a project with a collaborator, which has Aisha Leslie Bentham been a guest?
No.
She should.
I'll
connect you with her. But we're talking about devising a piece that's connected to the iconography of the folate head in Europe and the legend or folklore around the Green Man, which sometimes gets conflated, and its evolution as a tale of the connection between, like the human or man-nature relationship, and how over time the way that those things have been interpreted have changed to mirror the separation that we see now, especially within liturgical settings, and the opportunity for coming back to that and how we perform things like that. So there's like, as much as I want to create the tools, and a lot of my day-to-day work is about creating those tools, whether in an academic setting or in a field support, art support organization. That's what we're officially classified with by the council. And those settings for supporting or other artists is also bridging over into the creative practice as well, to try and put some of those things in out into the world.
And to experiment and to have fun.
Yeah. Yeah, it allows me to play with things as well and to continue to develop things. Yeah.
Well, I think our dog friend wants to go for a walk or something.
As possible. Well, she knows it's time for a walk because it's just after 3 and the bell nearby. Justine's going to go pick up.
But let's just end with the way we end every episode. I know you listen and read a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have recommendations, things that come to mind that you would say, hey, you guys, check this out?
I came up with a list because also in terms of where to start, but I'll distill it down because some of this are just like artists to check out. One, I'm going to be a little self-promotional. There is a documentary called Groundworks, which is available right now through PBS Passport. It was broadcast in the U.S. in 2022 that's connected to a project of the same name from 2018, which is about restoring land in Northern California. And so I just want to put that out there. If anybody's interested in connecting to it, we can make it available to folks.
It connects back to your roots at the beginning of the
Connects
episode
to California. It connects to, this is where we put into play a lot of the agreements and back-end information around collaborating between settler and indigenous artists and collaborators working on that. So for me, those sorts of projects are just as interesting in the back end as that. But insofar as like other things that I wanted to put out there as sort of like recommendations, well, insofar as what I've been reading recently, I just finished Kim Stanley Robertson's Antarctica, just because I'm fascinated with Antarctica as a place, the Antarctic Treaty, and it really unpacks, like in a narrative form, in the near future, the politics around the Antarctic Treaty, why it exists, how that intersects with contemporary resource questions. It also problematizes that sort of era of exploration with like Scott and Edmondson just like trying to get to the South Pole, and combines it with a little bit of the banal existence of contemporary life on that landmass or parts of it. There are two podcasts that I would recommend for folks listening to this. One is Any Part of Drilled, which is Amy Westervelt's series, and it overlaps with some of her other work as well for it. So anything that Amy Westervelt has done has been great. The more recent one, at least that I listened to, I don't know if there's another one since, has been around the introduction of the oil industry into Guyana and the politics surrounding that. But there's lots of fascinating aspects of that as well. There's also a season of Scene on Radio, which she co-hosted and talking about this development. And I think I'll end it just with one that especially, like, if you want to understand why we need to talk about the social infrastructure at the same time that we're talking about emissions within Canada, New Hampshire Public Radio's podcast Outside In has had a series within it called Powerline or Power Lines, which was based off of New Hampshire and Vermont looking to purchase power from Quebec. They trace back the development of the hydroelectric capacity that creates the situation where Quebec has some of the cleanest power in the world, which also precipitated the change in nation-to-nation relationships between the Cree Nation and Quebec, and the billions of dollars of multiple lawsuits that are still at play around the way that land is utilized for that. So understanding that from that outside perspective is always something that I point to quite a bit. So I think I'll leave it there in terms of recommendations. Like you said, I do read a lot of things. Right now I'm working through In Too Deep, which is a sociologist and someone I did theater with in university, Rachel Tolbert Kimbrough's book about the social dynamics around a specific neighborhood in Houston following Hurricane Harvey, with the hopes of maybe with some collaborators devising a piece in response to it. But it's really fascinating in terms of academic sociology texts.
Thank you so much, Ian, for your time.
Yeah.
And, we'll talk again.